Welcome to the Cybersecurity and Cloud Podcast, the podcast where we learn from cybersecurity experts how to stay safe, private, and secure on the cloud and in code. CSCP is hosted by Francesco Cipollone, your cybersecurity friend with a passion for all things cyber and sharing stories of other professionals with you. This episode is brought to you by the generosity of Phoenix Security Limited. Phoenix helps startups and enterprises solve complex software security supply chain visibility by leveraging the power of correlation and contextualization. Discover how Phoenix Security helps CISO and security engineers act fast, prevent burnout, and implement DevSecOps at the speed of cloud. Phoenix Security. Correlate, contextualize, and act on risk with one click. Let's dive in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cybersecurity and Cloud Podcast. This is your host, Francesco, and this is probably the last episode that we do in 2022. Is the 29th of December, 2022. We're almost on the end of the years, but we managed to squeeze in a last episode with Chris Hughes. And it's an absolute pleasure because with Chris, we've been interacting a lot over LinkedIn, teasing each other over a number of topics, and we said, is the time to come on the show and do a proper episode. So Chris, thank you very much for coming on the show. Chris is a consultant, he's the director of Acquia, and he's been in Air Force previously, so he's very heavily involved with a lot of US regulation around SBOM and around cybersecurity. And the US has facing a lot of change in late. And today in the episode, we're gonna dig in and explore this. But before digging in the exciting topic of SBOM and software supply chain, Chris, tell us a little bit more about you. How did you start? How did you get us to the point where you are today?
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to give you some background. I started off active duty Air Force. Prior to that, I always had an interest in computers and technology, but joined the Air Force and got put into cybersecurity. And at the time, I didn't really realize the opportunity. You're just a young kid, and then I started really taking an interest in it because it was a fascinating career field, and I've never stopped. I did 4 years in the Air Force, and then I've been a federal employee with the U.S. government twice. Once with the Navy, doing cloud and DevSecOps and cybersecurity for them, and then also with an organization known as GSA, the General Services Administration, which probably isn't too familiar for many, but if you've heard of FedRAMP, I was part of the FedRAMP team reviewing cloud services coming to the U.S. federal market there.
Right.
As a security SME, and then worked at a couple of different industry organizations in the DoD space, on software factories, and think of cloud and Kubernetes and containerized environments and all those kind of things for Space Force and Air Force and so on. And then ultimately just decided to give it a chance myself and co-founded Acquia, where I'm at now, with a couple of partners, and doing cybersecurity consulting in the public sector, but also a little bit in the commercial, but definitely mostly U.S. public sector focused. Mm-hmm. And, outside of that, like you mentioned, I'm really active on LinkedIn. I host a show myself called Resilient Cyber, and I'm pretty engaged with groups like Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Cloud Security Alliance, for example. Have contributed to several white papers and publications with them. And really passionate about all things cybersecurity, honestly.
And there isn't a new article regulation that comes out, and there is a whole competition of who can write a blog before that. And I really appreciate that, because I think it's pushing everybody out to the edge to actually write even faster.
Yeah, there's some awesome people out there that put out a lot of great information that I read, folks that you and I know, like Walter Haydock and such. So sometimes I enjoy writing, and for me, learning, I like to read something and write about it while I'm reading it. So if something new comes out, I like to try to quickly get an article out there and see, try to push other people, but it's all in good fun, honestly.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good banter and it's a good competition to actually write even faster and quicker. But maybe back in the day, what made you decide to actually engage this into a full-on career? You started in cyber, you started going more into cyber, and then as a full-on question, how did you saw the regulation and the industry changing, especially in the federal space of late?
Yeah, I mean, for me initially, it was, just kind of happenstance. Like I said, I got put into cyber. I was in the Air Force. I got out and, kind of just stuck with it just because it was easy to find a job doing what I did in the military. And then I saw like the economic opportunity that the career field has. It's a great career field, a lot of good job stability. It's, it's very high demand, for example. And I was always really interested in it. And then, I got married and started a family. I have 4 young kids. And once I started having kids, like, my motivation to work harder, to learn, to grow, my career just kind of took off from that point, and I've never stopped working hard since then. And as you mentioned, I think we're definitely seeing like an evolution of the regulation in this space. In our environment in the public sector, we've always had things like NIST and risk management framework, NIST 853, and think of NIST 80171 for defense industrial base, and then CMMC that people are talking about a lot now. Thinking about not just software supply chain, but supply chain risk management in general. Your vendors, your suppliers. That was a topic that's gotten a lot of attention as of late. And then obviously software supply chain. It's not necessarily a new topic. You can date, and Google actually had a white paper recently that they cited like an incident from 1984 or something where the United States did something to Russia with software. And it's like, wow, this issue has been around for a long time. But it's gotten more and more attention. I think is we've seen open source adoption kind of accelerate and go crazy. Everyone's using open source software. Most modern applications are made of open source software, and I think people are realizing, like I think Sonotype, for example, had a study showing that in the last 3 years there's like a 742% increase in software supply chain attacks. So malicious actors are definitely paying attention, and now I think that's making organizations, regulators, the industry pay attention and try to respond to this.
Brilliant. And I think I saw an enormous change in that. But I saw the US taking with the change of command in CISA, a really strong stand in the software supply chain. And that's when the whole industry kind of start paying attention on OSS and in general on the software supply chain, and started bringing with SBOM and the new regulation around SBOM with the I think it was the 2201 or 02 that brought out the whole topic of vulnerability management, but not just in infrastructure, but across the software security life cycle, that really, really break the chasm and change the paradigm on, this is something that we need to pay attention now. And when there is a regulation behind it, the whole public and private industry start paying attention. That generated the whole debate and topic. And as you rightfully say, it's not a new thing. I mean, software, we've been writing software since forever, but right now we've been really paying attention to it. So what do you think was the kind of singularity that made everything change and us really paying attention now to software supply chain attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think like we've talked about, the momentum has been slowly growing. There's been folks like Josh Corman, if you're familiar with him, who's kind of warning about this issue almost like a decade ago, in the medical device community, for example. But there's no arguing that, SolarWinds and the fallout from that, the thousands of organizations that impacted, kind of like, precipitated the whole follow-on executive order, executive order on cybersecurity, which had an entire section 4, dedicated to software supply chain security. And then out of that came a whole slew of activity where you had organizations like NIST producing a new version of SSDF, the Secure Software Development Framework, OMB, Office of Management and Budget, now kind of dictating that all suppliers selling software to the federal government need to start to attest to aligning with SSDF, providing things like SBOMs. And then you had, organizations like NTIA, where you had Dr. Alan Friedman and folks, working on these SBOM working groups, 2-3 years ago, and building that interest, building that maturity around SBOMs with their working groups with industry. And then, of course, he moved over to CISA and kind of has kept up that, that momentum since then. So I think that, definitely SolarWinds was the watershed moment, I think, from an attention perspective, and then the cybersecurity executive order and all the activity that's come after that. And as you mentioned, like, I think regulation is has and will continue to play a big part in this. Like, without regulation forcing the issue, suppliers are not necessarily incentivized to provide this information, that transparency. And many, I've been really focused or interested in the economic factors of cyber. Many consider cyber to be a market failure. They say, like, regulation is required for things to change. And I think it's, it's hard to argue with that, because if we just leave it up to the industry, they're not going to necessarily provide this information. Why would they? Just put some additional risk or scrutiny. So I think we're definitely seeing a lot of changes.
and security is often seen as a massive cost. So if there isn't a regulation behind it, there isn't a business justification to actually do it. But SBOM in particular, I think, attack one of the big topic in cyber, that is the asset management in general. That is a huge debated and often avoided topic in cyber, or in general in IT. It's not even a cyber problem. And I think the SBOM kind of industry has now brought to the topic a problem that is like, what do we do with SBOM? What do we do with this asset? And asset of asset, and who use those assets. So I think it has opened the Pandora box around asset management in software supply chain and non. What's your thought around it?
No, I think you're spot on. Like, I've been writing and talking about this recently, and like just digging in and reading a lot about it and looking back across my own career. Asset inventory has been a best practice for a long time. You think of like SANS critical controls, CIS critical controls, hardware, software asset inventory has been around for a long time, and we've always sucked at it. And it's always been difficult, and then you bring in like, the modern environment with the open source software, you have managed service providers, cloud service providers, software delivered as SaaS, software is increasingly complex in most modern environments. And, you look at like SBOM, as you mentioned, now you kind of open that Pandora's box of, it's not just like one app, it's all these components that are involved in the app. And then you have all your dependencies and all your transitive dependencies. And it just, it's a very complicated issue. Yeah. And we kind of just had been burying our head in the sand or ignoring it and pretending it didn't exist. And now, the light is on the issue and there's no ignoring it now. And organizations are really starting to try to grapple with like, okay, how do we get our hands around this? How do we understand like what our software supply chain is, our components that we're using? If we're a supplier, what are we using in our software? If we're a consumer, what's in the software that we're consuming? What are the vulnerabilities associated with that? So it's kind of opened that Pandora's box, like you said.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think after SBOM, there will be a whole, like you've wrote a really very on point article about the SaaS platform and the SBOM and who depend on the dependency. That is kind of on the topic as well of software supply chain, but on chaining fundamentally third-party supply chain. There's a whole debate of who depends on what from a software perspective, but in general. And I think going forward is even going to be more because there's been more attack around it. What's your thought about why the attacker focused more on the software side of things rather than in the infrastructure? Did we get better at infrastructure and defending infrastructure assets, or have we been ignoring completely the software aspect?
Yeah, it's actually it's a very hotly discussed and debated topic. There have been some claims, even by organizations like ONDNI, which is the Office Director of Director of National Intelligence in the United States, for example. They kind of stated that as organizations get better at doing the basics, the fundamentals, as attackers have gone upstream, for example. But then again, if you look at the headlines, we still have phishing, we still have lack of MFA, so we're still very bad at the fundamentals as an industry, it seems. But if you look at it from the attacker's perspective, like, they can target you as an individual organization, or they can target your supplier and have a cascading impact across hundreds, thousands of consumers downstream. And they may do that indiscriminately, just, whoever we get, whoever the consumers are, or they may look targetedly, like say SolarWinds, and say, who's using that? Okay, great. We want to get to them. Let's target the supplier and then have that downstream impact, onto the consumers downstream that we know are using them. I think it's kind of like it's just an efficiency thing. If they can see that it's way more efficient to target a supplier and have that cascading impact across the industry, thousands, of consumers versus targeting a single organization. So it's just an efficiency thing, an economy of scale thing from a malicious actor's perspective. And then also, I think they've realized, like as an industry, we just have really poor supply chain risk management practices. And so why not take advantage of it? They're always looking for the most efficient way to carry out their goals, so they just kind of have taken advantage of that reality.
And I think you brought up a topic that really fascinates me, that nowadays attacker and individual group works as a business. So they look at the unit of economics and what the smallest number of line of code that they can produce, they're going to hit the majority of the masses. And I think they talk ROI more than Blue Team does.
Yeah, no, I mean you're spot on. Like malicious actors are organized cybercrime is becoming very mature. It's a massive industry that generates a lot of revenue for like malicious actors around the world. Whether it's organized nation states doing it for purposes like that, or just crime groups doing it to make revenue and profits. And as you said, like they're going to look for the most efficient way to do that. For all the hype of think of like advanced quantum resistant encryption, for example, like those kind of things, like yes, that exists, but they're going to look for a more efficient, like they just don't have MFA, or they have like a poor password hygiene, for example.
Right.
They didn't patch known vulnerable software that has a patch available for like 4 years now. Like, so they'll just take advantage of the most efficient thing they can. It's just easier and makes more sense for them.
This episode is brought to you by the generosity of Phoenix Security Limited. Phoenix helps startups and enterprises solve complex software security supply chain visibility by leveraging the power of correlation and contextualization. Phoenix platform connects to your repositories, scanners, and cloud, correlates all the information, and provides you with a prioritized list of vulnerabilities that need to be addressed first. Discover how Phoenix Security helps CISOs and developers remove friction and maximize the use of DevSecOps professionals at phoenix.security. Phoenix Security. Correlate, contextualize, and act on risk with one click.
No, and I totally agree. And I think I was reading the other day an article about the fact that 76% of ransomware is leveraging vulnerability of more than 2 years old. So it's not like 0 day, it's not as quantum encryption breaking. I mean, those are cool topics to discuss about, but it's like, again, attacking on the basic. And I think maybe on the topic that you brought, we haven't been paying a lot of attention on software supply chain or in general software security. And if you consider even OWASP been around just 20 years. So we haven't had any standard or any kind of way to agree among us as an industry on what software is. And then on the flip side, we had a lot of CISO that comes from traditional, firewalling and securing servers. So software wasn't really their thing, or maybe in their agenda. And, how you grow, structure the way, how you structure your security strategy and your cybersecurity strategy. What do you think about that?
No, I think you're spot on. And I actually talked to Mark Curfey, from the OWASP Foundation, and he talked about how long they've been around, but how many problems we still have as an industry at the basic level. And then you talked about, like that. I think software supply chain actually presents something unique. You talked about like it's been 2 years, 2-year-old vulnerabilities that malicious actors are taking advantage of. Another unique thing about software supply chain attacks is like, how long have we heard just patch? You got to patch, right? But what happens when the patch is actually the attack vector is poisonous? So now you're like following a best practice that could compromise you. So that's a very difficult dichotomy there if your supplier's patch is compromised. And as you said, like, coming from different backgrounds, depending on the organization and, the CISO, the industry that they're in, the focus on software supply chain may not be there. They may be looking at security from a different angle around, when it comes to, like you said, software versus traditional security, this modern ecosystem we have of APIs and SaaS providers and open source software consumption. A lot of that's new to, security professionals, or at least organizations haven't necessarily always paid attention to that stuff. Not only that, but it's rapidly growing. The industry's changing so much, so fast that, a lot of these things are just simply new. We haven't matured as an industry to address them quite yet.
Right. And I think you shared the attack surface the other day of software supply chain. And if you compare that to modern attack, those are completely two total different way to attack. If you vector to attack fundamentally organization. So software supply chain attacks are totally new breed and methodology and technique. And I think if you come from an infrastructure, you struggle to get ahead of the curve and understand how a library that has the same name of another library could fundamentally match or be a vulnerability to your organization versus, you have a vulnerable service. A lot of traditional security folk relate to the vulnerable server. They don't relate to a repository somewhere or an account takeover or things like that.
Yeah, I think you're raising an interesting point. I've been talking a little bit about is like, we see the big push for zero trust, for example. But if you look at zero trust, at least how it's typically discussed, it's very network centric, architecture centric to the organization, our endpoints, our authentication, all those kind of things about the architecture. And you may be securing all of those things and doing that, doing those things right. And then you look at like open source software consumption, and you're just voluntarily pulling things in that you have no understanding of the pedigree, the provenance, who contributed to it, if it's secure or not, if it has vulnerabilities. So you may be doing all these things right from a architecture perspective, and then you're just voluntarily pulling things in with you're just implicitly trusting things when you think about software supply chain, which is an kind of anti-pattern for zero trust. So yeah, it's a new paradigm and a way of thinking about things that we just historically haven't done as an industry.
No, I agree, and I think maybe back in the podcast where we discussed with Walter on. Are we still siloed as an industry to think where you run software and how you build software? So you still have the debate between software security folks that thinks in a specific way and infrastructural cloud security folks that see things in a completely way. So are we still looking at software in a compartmentalized way versus full stack way?
Yeah, I think it definitely could be argued, and I've, I kind of like you, I started off in traditional IT and then, got into the cloud and things like that. And, I'm not a big fan of like, you'll hear arguments of, cloud is less secure than on-prem or, cloud is more secure than on-prem. And this simply doesn't work like that. There's a lot of factors at play, the supplier, the maturity of supplier, for example, me self-hosting something is not going to be in comparison to like, say, GitHub that's used by millions of people and has a massive organization of security, expertise behind it. There's a lot of factors that contribute to whether something is secure or not. It's not, so black and white. There's a lot of gray in there and nuance in there.
Right. And maybe a question for you. So what do you think is, well, as a security industry, what do you think are we facing in the next probably couple of years?
Yeah, it's a good question. We have a lot of
question.
Yeah, we have a lot of problems. It's we're coming up on 2023, as you said. It's prediction season, and you can look around and see a lot of great predictions that a lot of these things are true or will likely be true. We have a lot of problems, but looking at where we're headed, I think that we have a lot of maturing to do around how we look at the software supply chain. We have great things and efforts underway, like you talked about, like SBOM. Of course, we have two kind of competing standards there: SPDX and Cyclone DX. We'll see how adoption of both of those go, how organizations go about not just producing an SBOM, but like, what do I do with it now? Like how do I aggregate all of these and look at them across the enterprise that I have and understand and make informed decisions around risk and procurement and acquisition? How do I better vet my suppliers and understand my suppliers? So it's just a very, we have a complex problem set ahead of us with a lot of things to mature around. I think, as you said, it's a new paradigm for us in a lot of ways around security, and there's a lot of things that we need to figure out and mature as an industry still.
And that's all great, but it's a very complex topic, and we struggle a lot to actually bring the whole organization together along on the security journey. And now we're facing kind of a singularity where we have augmented the complexity of what we deal with for the nature of software that is complex. How do we translate all this complexity to a business decision maker that needs to decide, okay, I'll invest X amount to actually keep on building my software secure or keep on running my organization securely? So how do we shield the organization to the sheer amount of complexity that all this has?
Yeah, I like the word that you use. I think you use the word shield, the organization. I think it's like, we, to an extent, it's kind of security's responsibility to abstract away a lot of the complexity. Like, we shouldn't be expecting the board or business leaders to be cybersecurity experts, for example.
Right.
And that's where I think, think of things like risk quantification. If you look at how we communicate risk, it's almost all qualitative. It's very subjective. It's based on, gut instinct and experience. And it doesn't really, we haven't really done a great job of maturing how we communicate business risk in dollars, and communication that they understand as a business. We have great books like How to Measure, Cybersecurity Risk from folks like Doug Hubbard that came out many years ago, and then there's already a version 2 coming out. But if you look at the industry, like we have FAIR and we have things like that, but they're not really adopted very well in many organizations. They're not implemented at scale that I've seen in the industry. So I think as an organization or as an industry in terms of cyber, we again need to mature how we communicate with the business, putting things into business terms. You often hear about the CISO having a seat at the table and needing to speak the language of the business. Well, the business speaks dollars and cents. So
Right.
we need to put that risk in that kind of term so that they understand it, the implications of it, and can make risk informed decisions about it. We shouldn't expect them to be security experts, and they're not going to understand the software supply chain when we as a profession are still getting our hands around it ourselves.
Right. So translating fundamentally the whole traditional problem of attack vector and vulnerability and into probability of exploitation and to impact and the probability of that impact to happen, those are terms that fundamentally any business-minded person can relate to and can understand in terms of risk and do something about it, like mitigate risk with dollar.
Yeah. I mean, you're using the terms that, like, I think back to a decade ago or more when I took like CISSP, and there was like, likelihood and probability of exploitation and of likelihood of occurrence, and like no one ever really talks about those things for some reason in the practical world. Like we just, you, me, and others have talked about a lot on LinkedIn is like, we talk about CVSS base scores and severity, but there's no context or nuance behind it. Like, is it actually exploitable? How likely is it to be exploited? If there is an exploit available, what's the maturity of the exploit? Is it proof of concept? Is it known to be exploited? If you look at like resources like CISA has their known exploited vulnerability list, for example, or you have things like EPSS that's starting to grow and mature, to see what's the probability that this vulnerability will be exploited, and then understand, like, organizationally, what kind of factors do we have in place to mitigate the risk? What's our environment set up? How are our configurations in place that may make this vulnerability exploitable or not even exploitable and totally irrelevant for us? Now, so those are things that we need to really get down to the bottom of, but that all takes a lot of time, energy, and effort to get, kind of flush those details out. So it's a tough challenge.
No, I totally agree, and that's my pet peeve. That's the thing that I talk all the time about, because I've been in finance organization for long, and that's all they want to talk about. Risk quantification, investing X amount of money to actually exploit X amount of opportunity, and business people don't talk vulnerability, don't talk cyber, they talk money and money against money. So I think I've seen the paradigm shift a lot around contextualization, cyber risk quantification, but I still haven't seen. I've seen a lot of talk about it, but I've seen a struggle in adoption. What do you think is that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's actually my experience as well. Is like I said, like there's great material out there on cyber risk quantification. We need to speak the language of the business. They have things like FAIR and the Risk Institute and other things like that. And we hear probability like EPSS and so on, and putting things in the business term and quantifying it to dollars and cents. But as an industry, I haven't seen that at scale in any large organization. At least in my personal experience, that I've run into in the public or private sector quite yet. Some people have had pilot programs or efforts to try to do that, but I haven't really seen it done at scale quite yet. And I think it's got to be a hill that we climb if we're going to move past, being siloed and being part of the business, the part of the leadership team, communicating in business terms and understanding how we can, communicate with our peers.
Or maybe we need regulation around it.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe that's another factor that drives, forcing us to communicate in those terms and actually quantify things and put those metrics out there, because otherwise maybe we continue to go on as we have, doing qualitative, subjective, assessments and kind of speculation.
I agree. Chris, we're coming to a close, and we have a brilliant tradition in the show that is not live on a doom and gloom like we always do in cyber, but live on a positive note. So in your opinion, how has the industry changed, or what is the positive sign that we start seeing, and to leave fundamentally our audience on a positive note?
Yeah, I think while we've talked about a lot of the challenges and problems, I think the fact that we're even talking about these is a good sign, because there's been years. Like, it's not as if the use of open source software or a software supply chain as a concept is new. We just simply didn't address it previously as an industry. And so we're seeing a lot of momentum from groups like Linux Foundation, OpenSSF, CISA, the federal government in the United States. We're seeing European regulations start to come out around software supply chain, suppliers, SBOMs. So we have a lot of great momentum underway. Same thing on the, cyber risk quantification. We're seeing a push for having cyber expertise in the boardroom from groups like SEC, for example. I think we're moving in the right direction, and we have a lot of problems ahead of us, but that's also exciting. We have a lot of things we get to solve and tinker with and try to solve as an industry and as professionals, and that makes me interested and engaged. And I hope everyone else is along on the journey and excited as I am about the opportunity.
Absolutely, I've seen the paradigm shift, and I'm super excited about what's up to come. But if folks want to follow more about the US set of regulation or what you talk about, where they can find more about you?
Yeah, for me, I'm super active, as I said, on LinkedIn. Just find me at Chris Hughes. I think it's at Resilient Cyber on LinkedIn is my URL. And then same thing on Twitter, although I don't really use Twitter too much. It's a little bit different than LinkedIn, a different world. But that said, I also have a Substack I started a couple months ago where I talk about these topics, on a weekly basis. It's resilientcyber.substack.com. And then I have Resilient Cyber, the podcast as well. And I'm happy to connect and chat with anyone about all these topics. I'm always learning myself and looking to learn from others and pass along what I learn. As I said, we're all in this together. So I'm definitely open to chat with anyone.
Fantastic. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show. And everybody, there is a tons of material out there. Push your organization towards adopting a more mature maybe surface, because it can make you more reputable and more solid even before regulation comes around, because then you'll be prepared.
Yeah, we always talk about just a closing note. We hear about shifting security left. This is an opportunity to do that. Instead of being reactive, waiting for regulation to come along and kind of encourage you to do these best practices or things that we're seeing emerge as things that we should be doing. Get ahead of that curve. If we know we need to start quantifying cyber risk, we know we need to start talking about software supply chain security as an organization or business. Now is your opportunity to get in there and start doing those kind of things.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris, for coming on the show. And everybody stay safe out there. And I wish you everybody a fantastic 2023. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcast and post it on social media tagging Cybersecurity Cloud Podcast for a chance to win a $100 Amazon gift card. Discover other episodes at www.cybersecuritypodcast.com.